Hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Len Shackleton, the Editorial and Research Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and today I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Davis, the IEA's Head of Education and himself a distinguished historian. Now, Steve has written a chapter in the IEA's recent anthology on free speech. This is the book called Having Your Say, Threats to Free Speech in the 21st Century. And Steve has written about freedom of speech in universities. Now, a lot of people have had a lot to say about that recently, but in his chapter, Steve takes an interesting angle, which locates the discussion in the wider context of property rights. And he argues from a classical liberal position that any organization, whether it be a university or a bank or a TV company, has the right to prohibit certain types of speech on its real or virtual premises, and to use freely entered into contracts to limit individuals' freedom of expression. What is important in Steve's view is our ability to choose from a wide range of institutions rather than imposing common standards on all of these institutions. So I welcome Steve. Hello.
Hello, and great to be here with you, Len.
Well, let's begin by basics. Steve, you're not a 21st century Cardinal Newman, but what's your idea of the university in the 21st century?
Well, I actually am a bit like Cardinal Newman in terms of what I think the university should be, and that is it should be a place where people collectively gather, both scholars and students, to study knowledge, and the goal should be the search of the truth. And also, I think, as Newman said, the creation of a certain kind of character or mental outlook on the world, an inquiring and inquisitive one, but shaped by the search for truth. There is still a lot of that going on in universities, but also I'm afraid in terms of what sociologists would call their functional status in the contemporary world, particularly the Anglo-Saxon world, the university has become mainly a certification machine. Its main purpose is to give people certificates, degrees, which then in turn give access to high status and high paying occupations. And as far as the students who pay university fees are concerned, and even more so their increasingly anxious and fraught parents, that is the main point of it. Any kind of learning or search after truth that goes on is a kind of side product of that underlying main goal. And I deeply regret this, but I do think that this is actually reality that we're confronted by.
Now, tell me more about this business of property rights and how that ties in with your conception of free speech.
Well, I am a believer in free speech, but I think a moment's reflection will tell us that there is no absolute and unlimited right to free speech in all times and all places, regardless of any other circumstances, because there is the other very important right of property rights, and property gives the holder of the property right the right to determine what use can be made of the space and things that they own and have property rights over. And part of that includes the right to prohibit certain kinds of speech or speech acts in the widest sense from taking place in or on the property that you own. So if you own a house, you do not have to sit there and let anybody say anything they like in your house. You can ask them to stop saying certain things or leave. That's your prerogative. It comes with the right of ownership. Now, that also applies to corporate persons such as universities or companies. They own the premises. The university owns the buildings which form its physical plant, if you will. And as a core person, as a free association with personal rights, if you will, that it has a perfect right to prohibit certain kinds of speech on its premises, should it wish to do so. And that's within the scope of it. And that is one of the many actual limitations that arise on the exercise of free speech in the context of a free society where other kinds of rights are commonly recognized. And as you said in your initial remarks, this also extends to the virtual world. So if the university has a virtual channel, which it uses for teaching and for the dissemination of research findings and things of that sort, or discussion, it also has a right to prohibit speech on those grounds. And this kind of thing may extend to, for example, the university not allowing its employees or its students to say certain things in the context of lectures or teaching discussions, or indeed informal conversations that take place on the property on various grounds, because they don't want their staff or students being upset or agitated, or they just think it will bring them a bad repute. They can have any reason, actually. They don't even have to give a good reason for it, in my view. It's all part of what comes with owning the property.
I can see this working in a forward-looking kind of way. But what, you're getting people now in universities and other institutions who are being penalised for things which they put on social media a long time ago, before necessarily they were contracted with that institution.
Yeah, indeed.
So, I mean, how does this play out?
Well, you raise two slightly different issues in that question there. One is the question of whether or not people should be penalised for things they have said in the past. In fact, in many cases, in the very distant past. And I think that people can certainly be challenged and asked if those are still their views, but it's not the case, in my view, that therefore they should face sanction by the employer for something they did when, A, not on the premises of the university or as the employer, and before they were in the university's employment. The university and their colleagues may think worse of them because they've done this and maybe still hold these views. And they might well find they're shunned when it comes to the senior common room, and people cut them dead all the time. But I don't think they should face employment sanctions for something that happened a long time ago. And I must say that the current trend for no forgiveness for youthful indiscretions is quite remarkable. And I must say, if I was the owner of, if I was the CEO of Twitter or some of the other platforms, I'd be rather alarmed about this, because the rational response of most people is to not go on these platforms or make any statements if you know that everything you say is going to be held against you in 30 years' time. I hate to think about some of the things I said in my foolish youth that fortunately have never been recorded. So that's one issue. The other issue is the question of when people in employment to a learned institution, or for that matter, any other company, make statements on social media, like off the premises, so to speak. Now, this is actually a very tricky one, because the contract of employment can stipulate quite reasonably and fairly, I think, and this is contract law, not property rights, that as an employee of an organization, you should not say certain things or engage in certain activities while wearing an official hat. So if you officially make it clear that you are speaking on social media or elsewhere as a member of the university or an employee of the university, then I think the university has a right to say, no, there are certain things you can't and shouldn't say. The problem arises when this is then extended to anything that you say. And there is a very alarming trend, which the American philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, for example, has explored recently, for private firms of all kinds to take a quite ridiculous degree of interest in what their employees are doing outside their hours of employment and on their own property and out in the public space. And universities are no exception to this rule. And it seems to me that's a gross overextension or overstretch. What you do in your private capacity outside your terms of employment and hours of employment should not be any concern of your employer. And it's a kind of overstretch of private rights into a sphere that really, if it should be used at all, should only be done by government for private firms and universities to try and penalise people for that. So if a university academic expresses quite strong controversial opinions on Twitter, but does so making it clear that these are his own private personal opinions and he's not speaking in an official capacity, then I think that's perfectly fine, and he or she should not face sanction. The tricky bit is that very often institutions, both academic and otherwise, have a clause in the contract saying you can't do something which brings the institution into disrepute. And there are good reasons for this, of course. To the extent that you are still in the public mind associated with the institution, if it becomes known that you hold views or do things, for that matter, which are regarded disreputable, you may indeed bring the institution to disrepute. And there's a standard procedure in a lot of sports bodies, for example, for sportsmen and women to be sanctioned if they bring the sport into disrepute. And I think that's that is the kind of thing where you need the courts, because I think that's actually a very, very hard area. And I don't think you can make a hard and fast rigid distinction there. You really do have to let the courts decide the hard cases, which I think they do a pretty good job of doing, actually.
Interesting. Steve, you are a historian, and one of the things I noticed in your chapter was your reference to Ayn Rand's
Yeah.
the things which she said at the time of the Berkeley free speech, a very, very different kind of free speech discussion, that I think. But could you, for the benefit of people who are not familiar with that period, could you remind us of that?
Well, this was a major student uprising which took place in the early 1960s at the University of California at Berkeley, one of the most prestigious universities in the United States and the kind of crown jewel of the University of California system, the state university system, which is crucial here. And it was really the beginning of the 1960s counterculture, the very first event of it. And what emerged was a movement on the campus of the university led by a chap called Mario Savio, the aim of which was to argue that the speech codes and controls that the university and its president, a chap called Kent, had in place should be struck down, that students should be free to say whatever they liked. In particular, what Savio and the other radicals like him wanted to do was to attack both the Vietnam War and the policy of the US government there, and the close association, as they saw it, between the institution of the university and the US defense sector, which was undoubtedly a reality. And they wanted to have the right on the campus to do this. And this led to a further pushing. It led to the establishment of what was called a free speech zone on the campus, in which all kinds of stuff, including obscene speech that at the time was sanctioned under state law on grounds of obscenity, was uttered and so on. And Ayn Rand wrote about this, and she was very critical of the speech protesters and their logic. And her argument was that there was a right to free speech, but as she said very explicitly, almost in capitalized letters, I think it was in the original essay, there is no right to free speech on somebody else's property. And she made the point that while she didn't agree with the war in Vietnam, and she didn't agree with much of the policies of the university, she thought that the university had every right to stop the students who were on its premises from doing things of which they didn't want to do or disapproved. And she thought the arguments being made by the FSM, as it was called, the free speech movement, were incoherent for that reason. She did point out, though, that there was a kind of complicating factor, which was that the university, unlike, say, Harvard or Yale, which are private institutions, was a public university. It was funded by the California taxpayer in the shape of, the state and Department of Board of Education in California. And so she said this was actually confusing because it meant it was a public institution, and therefore it was a question of whether or not it was the state that was acting to restrict free speech, which she thought would have been highly improper. And her view was that this was yet another reason for not having state universities, because it muddied the waters where questions of free speech were concerned. The essay is still worth reading because it has her usual characteristic forcefulness and clarity. You may not agree with what she says, but there's no doubt about the thrust of her argument.
Yeah, one of the things, another of the things you talk about is the idea that maybe we should have not a single policy right across universities, but universities should be free to choose their own attitudes to free speech, and the consumer could choose between them in a sense. Yeah. How realistic do you think that is, Steve, in a situation where the state is omnipresent in universities?
Well, that's the big problem. Let me say what I think should be the case. I think at the moment there is a lot of argument that, which is well taken, that there's a kind of ideological conformity at universities, and that increasingly the staff are dominated by people of a particular ideological persuasion, and that there's a kind of rather stultifying atmosphere amongst both staff and students in which certain kind of opinions people are scared to express them because they feel that they are such a fringe outlying belief or opinion to hold. Now, the problem, I think, is not so much that there is such an orthodoxy on any one institution, it's that all institutions adhere to roughly the same orthodoxy. In other words, if we had a range of institutions with different orthodoxies, if you will, as well as some that were more pluralistic, which I think would be a good thing, I think that's actually what I would prefer myself, then it would be a straightforward matter, as you say, of consumer choice. You might be able to choose to go to a university that had very strict speech codes and which banned a whole lot of supposedly reactionary speech, or you might choose to go to a Catholic university which equally insisted upon only speech and teaching which adhered to the doctrine of the church, or you might go to a more pluralistic open one, or you might go to a conservative or classical liberal oriented institution. There would be a whole range of things to choose from, and I think that would be very, very good. And you'd have a variety of types of speech code. Now, you ask, is this realistic? Well, I think in one sense it is realistic. I think there would be actually a lot of demand for this, and it would the greater pluralism would actually make the university sector much more thriving. The problem is that universities are, as you say, intertwined with government because of the degree of state funding that there is, and this means that one problem is the extent to which regulations of various kinds, usually emanating from the Treasury, but as well also the DfE, prevent this kind of variety and pluralism in the name of purportedly neutrality, but the neutrality in effect turns out to be neutrality only in favor of one position. But there are other problems as well, and one of them is that the pervasive and paranoid, you might say, but ultimately justified fear of lawsuits on the parts of university administrators. They're quite simply terrified of lawsuits by students and or their parents or others. And I think that they're justified in this because you might say that the risk of a lawsuit is quite low, but the problem is that if one happens, from the university's point of view, it's a disaster in terms of both reputational costs and monetary costs. And I think this all comes from the United States, and it's a spillover effect from the predatory and dysfunctional American justice system, and not only in this area either. And to the extent that many universities have lots of overseas students, including significant numbers of North Americans, it's a serious concern. So that's another problem we have to face. And the final problem is related to the function of universities, which we talked about a few minutes ago, which is that the obvious problem if universities have a kind of monopoly line, they're all uniform, there's a kind of, vanilla blandness or lack of variety to their political and free speech positions. The obvious solution is for people to set up private institutions, which historically is what has been done. When Oxford and Cambridge were monopoly Anglican institutions that wouldn't take Roman Catholics or dissenters, what the dissenters and Catholics did was to set up their own institutions, places like the Warrington Academy, which later becomes one of the colleges here at Oxford, or the UCD in Dublin. That is now very difficult because it would be very difficult for new institutions of that kind to be able to perform the certification function that state-funded universities have. And without that, they would find it very, very hard to attract enough students or enough funding. So that's the big barrier to the greater pluralism that we really do need in the sector, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Very difficult with an incumbent that's several hundred years old, like Balliol College, where you're sitting, to challenge that position by new entry, which is what you get in a normal kind of business. But if I can press you on this a little bit, Steve, even if it were possible for institutions to diversify in this way and to separate themselves out in terms of what they will allow and what they won't allow in free speech, it's actually a good thing. You'd be surrounded, people would go to those areas, like their favorite breakfast cereal or something, and you'd never meet anybody else who had a rival kind of view.
I agree that this is a second best situation. The obvious ideal view is that most institutions would have a range of opinion amongst both their staff and their students. What you would have taking place in the institution is a full and frank and often maybe heated, but hopefully polite discussion and conversation, which would expose people to positions that they were not familiar with and which would challenge their own views. That's the ideal you want to have. And obviously the problem I think we have is that we're such a long way away from that now increasingly. We've moved so far and so rapidly away from that in the last 20 or 30 years, no more than that actually, that I think the position I've said of pluralism between institutions is probably the best we can do right now, in the near future anyway. It's an example of what the Dutch call pillarization, because historically Dutch society was organized into parallel pillars, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Calvinists, basically, and secular Labour ones. And each one had its own social clubs, its own institutions, its own newspapers. It was almost like parallel societies. And that was how Dutch society was right up until really the 1970s. And that's the kind of world that I think we would have. And I do regret that, but I think that is preferable to having a kind of increasingly stifling uniformity, not least because I think that views that are not finding expression in either academia or elsewhere are likely to fester and very often take very dangerous forms. And that is actually not good for anybody, including the people who are in the dominant orthodoxy, not least because they will become intellectually fat and flabby and not able to defend their own positions because they're not being subject to enough robust critique. If you believe anything in this world, the one thing you fear is not a robust and penetrating critique. You should welcome that because it keeps you on your toes, and you never know, you might be wrong, and you will be persuaded to see the error of your ways. What you should fear is intellectual complacency and not being able to defend your position because you've never had to respond to serious criticism.
I mean, one of these things about setting up an institution, a dissenting institution and so on, is that, of course, over time, these things change, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking today, particularly at the London School of Economics, which is a world-class institution and you know, a terrific place, set up by the Fabians to push a socialist line. By the 1930s, you know, it had the you know, a really strong economics department, which was like classical liberal, you know, with people like Robbins and Hayek and so forth. It's funny how those kind of things can change. But interestingly, of course, it swung back again. And I don't know whether you saw last week that there's a group called LSE Class War that wants to have the LSE's Hayek Society closed down because it promotes, I've got it written down here, promotes ideologies that are harmful to marginalized students. So defend Hayek and the LSE to me.
Well, I must say, the Webbs, Sydney and Beatrice, must be turning in their grave at this, because you mentioned how the Department of Economics at the LSE had a very strong classical and neoclassical bent. That actually was due to the Webbs, because to their great credit, they did not stuff the whole institution full of Fabian socialists like themselves. They wanted an institution that would have academic credibility. And so, as well as hiring people like Lord Beveridge and Harold Lasky, obviously strong socialists, they also hired people like Edwin Cannon, one of the great defenders of classical economics, and subsequently other people like Hayek, who mentioned, Robbins, Arnold Planck, and others. And so the Webbs would be horrified, I think, by what is going on at their institution now. And it's obviously not in the interest of the institution. Now, the people you mentioned, I don't know if they have any connection with the old class war organization, which was a kind of anarcho-communist organization that used to go around smashing up rich people's cars and things. But I would say that this is a kind of student movement. What they're asking for is for the student union to disaffiliate the Hayek Society, not the university as a whole. I noticed that they've also asked that the LSE should not take any privately educated students, which rather ironically would bar most of them, which I suppose reflects well on their commitment to their principles, but would also bar the great majority of the South Asian and East Asian students that attend the LSE these days, which I'm not sure they want to do. So I think this is extremely annoying, and it shows something very alarming about the intolerance towards free speech among certain parts of the student body. But I don't think that in itself it's a serious threat, because for one thing, it's only a claim that the Hayek Society should be disaffiliated from the student union. Excuse me, and if that happens, that's very annoying, and it makes it very difficult to carry on the society's activities because you can't use the student union buildings. But it doesn't stop the society being formed. It doesn't stop it doing anything, doing its business, maybe just in pubs or other meeting places off the campus. And here in Oxford, the Oxford Union, of course, was actually set up precisely because the university and other groups like the church did not allow free discussion of certain things. You had to conform to the 39 articles. So what the students did was they set up an independent body, which was not affiliated to the university and which eventually had its own premises. And so the student union can make life very difficult for student societies if they disaffiliate you, but they can't ultimately stop you doing what you want to do. So this is extremely annoying. As I say, it's a bad indicator, but I don't see it as a serious threat.
Yeah, it came too late for your contribution to the book, Stephen. I haven't spoken to you about this, but Gavin Williamson is proposing a bill which would give the Office for Students some control over student unions, and there's talk of a free speech champion and fining universities which allow no platforming of people and so on. Do you think this is a good idea?
No, I don't. I think it's a really bad idea, actually. I think this is a kind of classic case of a admittedly bad problem producing a government response which will make things worse, because the ultimate kind of outcome of that is for the government to effectively take on the role of regulating what kind of speech should and shouldn't be allowed at universities. And so I certainly, what they're saying, what Gavin Williamson is saying, is that the regulator, the free speech champion, would penalise universities that had no platform policy. But then the trouble is this to be a completely open no platform policy? First of all, it violates the property rights of the universities, which I mentioned earlier on, and their rights as self-governing communities and associations of scholars to regulate themselves. But also, seriously, if somebody was from a banned organisation like Al Muhajirun or one of the far-right organisations that's been banned recently, would they be given a platform? You can duck the question by saying, oh, these are illegal organisations. But then on the other hand, let's say it's not an illegal organisation, but one that has views of a similar kind. Is the government going to say these should be given a platform, regardless of what the university thinks? I think that's a very foolish idea. And in practice, what would happen is that the government would take over the role. And I do not want any government of any political persuasion to have that kind of power. I think it's extremely dangerous. And I said this is a really bad idea.
I mean, I can see sort of analogous cases in a way to laws on discrimination. We accept, or most people accept, that the government forbids discrimination in employment and so forth. But isn't this a rather similar sort of thing? You know, that a company, an organisation ought to be able to discriminate against women, for example, if it chooses to do so. But you know, we don't accept that, or it's not generally accepted.
Actually, I think that companies universities are ill-advised to discriminate on that basis, not least because it means they're probably not going to get the optimal staff for the job. But actually, I would defend their right to do that. I actually am quite a hard-line libertarian on this in both regards. I think that there should not be some kind of statutory anti-discrimination law. There is a common law redress, because if you as an applicant for a job feel that you have been passed over, say, a job or promotion perhaps, simply because of a discriminatory judgment on the part of your employer or management superiors, which clearly flies in the face of your own, let's say, qualifications or talent, then you should be able to bring a civil action, I think. But I would leave this up to the civil law. I don't think you need to have a general anti-discrimination principle. And I think that, again, it violates the rights of private associations and private employers. I know that's a very unpopular position. A lot of people don't hold it. And I can understand why governments have brought this in. It was done because they wanted to speed up the process of bringing previously marginalized groups in who were not part of the magic circle, so to speak, who did not have the advantage of being part of the establishment network. But that's a problem, I'm afraid, that you're always going to have. And I think this is not a good way of resolving it. I think that allowing greater new entry and pluralism of institutions is actually the way to deal with that kind of problem. Because if the problem you're facing is a kind of magic circle which creates structural advantage and disadvantage for certain people, then I think the thing to do is to try and break that magic circle through competition. It's essentially a kind of, in a way, a kind of cartel. And as with cartels of other kinds, the key to breaking structural advantage and disadvantage is greater competition and innovation. Whereas if you try to do it through regulation, what happens is that you get instead a box-ticking exercise in which the institutions simply take what actions they can or have to take in order to avoid sanctioning under the regulations. It becomes a box-ticking exercise. And the actual evidence is that it doesn't actually address the structural advantage and disadvantage that people are complaining about. You may not have any overt discrimination, but in fact, it's still very much there. There's still a kind of old boy and old girls network that is as powerful as ever, I think. So when you're dealing with that phenomenon, which I think is a real one, structural advantage or disadvantage, barriers to entry, if you will, for staff and others, the way to do it, I think, is to, as it is with any cartel, is to have challenges and to bust up that magic circle.
Okay, if we can just finish off with returning really to something which has popped up several times, the role of the state. How could we move towards a university sector with a minimal role for the state, and what would that minimal role be, do you think?
Well, I think that in order to move towards a much more limited role for government, we need to make it, first of all, easier to set up higher education institutions. But most importantly, I think we need to move the university away from what has become its dominant function, that of certifying people in the cause of their greater employability. And I think this should be done anyway, because I believe that this is destroying university and scholarship and teaching in universities. It's a terribly bad process, I think, and phenomenon. And so I think that what we should do is look to do that. In the short run, you probably have to have a lot of places which will be a bit like monasteries for the dedicated, or perhaps for refugees, for people, both students and staff, who simply can't take the kind of state of affairs that you find in official institutions anymore. But I hope that ultimately it will start to do that. I think we also need to make radical reforms in the way that research is funded, and to have far more decentralised and private funding of research. At the moment, the government dominates research through the research councils, and apart from the government, it's a very small number of large private donors who tend to drive most research. And I think, again, this has had an extremely bad effect on the quality and direction of a lot of academic research, particularly in the sciences, not so much in the humanities and social sciences, although it's bad there as well, particularly in the social sciences. But it's really bad for the scientists, I think. It's corrupted a lot of what they're doing. And it lies behind a lot of the big crisis of non-replicability that we see in the sciences right now. And so I think that also we need to do that. Now, universities are not going to do this themselves, because right now they're basically growing fat from sucking on the teeth of government spending. And to go back to the original free speech movement, Mario Savio and his associates in the 1960s, one of their demands, which I strongly supported actually, was that the University of California should not be taking tons of money from the US Defense Department, which after Sputnik had been flooding the US higher education sector with tons of money. I think actually the criticisms that the Students for a Democratic Society, called the Student Radical Organization, made of this at the time were well taken. And I think that we need to revisit those kinds of arguments. And universities need to wean themselves off this. But how you do this is the difficult question.
Well, thanks, Steve. As usual, some provocative stuff there, and no doubt we'll hear from you again on this. Well, thank you for watching as well. If you'd like to directly support the IEA's digital output, you can sign up to become an IEA patron. You'll get early access to our videos, bespoke IEA perks, and other exclusive benefits. So head over to patreon.com/IEA London, or follow the link in the description box to find out more. Goodbye.